On the night of June 5th, 1969, sensors buried in the jungle around Fire Support Base Crook began detecting movement. Lots of movement. Hundreds of North Vietnamese soldiers were moving through the tree line 8.5 miles northwest of Tay Ninh City. The American soldiers inside FSB Crook watched their radar screens and sensor readouts and knew exactly what was coming, a massive attack. And they were ready. Because FSB Crook was not just another fire base, it was a trap. Make sure you subscribe to our channel to discover more untold stories from history. This is the story of one of the most lopsided victories of the Vietnam War. The story of how one company of American infantry and one battery of artillery held off two entire North Vietnamese regiments over 3 consecutive nights. The story of 400 North Vietnamese soldiers killed versus 1 American dead and 8 wounded. The story of a fire base that was deliberately designed, constructed, and positioned to attract enemy attacks so that overwhelming American firepower could destroy them. This is the Battle of Fire Support Base Crook. 3 nights in June 1969, when Bravo Company of the 3rd Battalion, 22nd Infantry, the Walking Regulars, proved that when American forces chose their ground carefully, prepared their defenses thoroughly, and had the firepower to back it up, they were almost invincible. By June 1969, the Vietnam War had been raging for years. American forces had been in country in large numbers since 1965. The massive battles of 1968, the Tet Offensive, Khe Sanh, Hue City, were over. President Richard Nixon had been in office for 5 months and was implementing his policy of Vietnamization, preparing to gradually withdraw American forces and turn the war over to the South Vietnamese. But in June 1969, there were still over 400,000 American troops in Vietnam. And they were still fighting, still conducting operations, still building fire support bases in enemy territory, and still finding ways to kill North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers who were determined to drive them out of the country. The 25th Infantry Division, known as Tropic Lightning, had been operating in the area around Tay Ninh since 1966. Their area of operations included War Zone C, one of the most hostile regions in all of South Vietnam. War Zone C stretched from the Cambodian border down through Tay Ninh province almost to Saigon. It had been communist-controlled territory for years. Massive tunnel complexes, supply depots, training camps, base areas. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army owned War Zone C, and Tay Ninh was ground zero. The provincial capital sat just a few miles from the Cambodian border, dominated by Nguy Ba Den, the Black Virgin Mountain, a 3,700-foot peak that rose out of the flat jungle like a fist. The communists used the mountain and the surrounding jungle as staging areas for attacks throughout the region, and by mid-1969, they were preparing for another major offensive. Into this environment, 25th Infantry Division deployed fire support bases, small fortified positions, usually containing a battery of artillery and a company or two of infantry, positioned to provide fire support for operations and to interdict enemy movement. And by 1969, the Americans had learned something important. Fire support bases were not just defensive positions. They could be offensive weapons, bait, decoys, deliberately positioned to attract enemy attacks so that overwhelming American firepower could destroy the attackers. Fire Support Base Crook was one of those decoy fire bases, and in early June 1969, it was about to prove the concept worked. Fire Support Base Crook was established in April 1969, approximately 14 kilometers northwest of Tay Ninh City, just a few miles from the Cambodian border. The location was chosen very deliberately. It sat astride suspected enemy infiltration routes. It was close enough to the border to threaten communist base areas in Cambodia, and it was positioned in terrain where the Americans believed the enemy would have to attack if they wanted to maintain control of their supply lines and staging areas. The fire base was built to house 2 main units, Bravo Company of the 3rd Battalion, 22nd Infantry Regiment, and Alpha Battery of the 7th Battalion, 11th Artillery Regiment. Total garrison, maybe a company and a half of infantry and 6 artillery pieces. Perhaps 200 men total, not a large force, but they would not be fighting alone. The construction of FSB Crook was extensive and deliberate. This was not a fire base thrown together in a day or two. This was a carefully engineered fortress designed to maximize American firepower and minimize enemy chances of breaking through. Bulldozers were brought in to clear fields of fire around the perimeter, but the clearing was not uniform. American engineers deliberately left isolated patches of jungle and concealment, small groves of trees, clumps of bamboo, dense undergrowth in specific locations. These were not mistakes. These were traps. The engineers knew that North Vietnamese reconnaissance teams and forward observers would try to use these patches of concealment to get close to the fire base and observe American positions. So, the patches were positioned exactly where American radar could cover them, and where direct fire from the 105mm howitzers inside the fire base could be brought to bear instantly. Any North Vietnamese soldier who tried to use those patches of concealment for observation would be detected by sensors or radar and destroyed by artillery fire before he even knew he had been spotted. Around the fire base, bulldozers cut concentric circles in the jungle. Like racetracks, one circle at 100 to 150 meters from the fighting positions, another circle at 300 meters. These served multiple purposes. They denied enemy rocket-propelled grenade gunners ideal firing positions. The RPG, the Soviet-designed anti-tank weapon that the North Vietnamese used extensively, was most effective at ranges under 300 meters. By clearing circles at those distances, the Americans forced RPG gunners to fire from longer ranges where accuracy dropped dramatically. The circles also served as kill zones. Anything moving in those cleared areas could be seen and engaged. Starlight scopes, the early night vision devices that amplified ambient light, allowed American soldiers to see movement at night in those cleared circles. And once spotted, mortars, machine guns, and artillery could be called in instantly. The bunker line around FSB Crook was built to standard 25th Infantry Division specifications, which by 1969 were quite sophisticated. Bunkers were constructed from heavy timbers, sandbags, and in some cases metal culverts or shipping containers. Each bunker had overhead cover thick enough to withstand direct hits from mortar rounds. Each had firing ports oriented to provide interlocking fields of fire with neighboring bunkers, and each was connected to other bunkers by communication trenches so troops could move around the perimeter without exposing themselves. The bunkers were not randomly placed. They were positioned to cover specific sectors. Each bunker had a primary sector of fire and a secondary sector that overlapped with adjacent bunkers. This meant that any point on the perimeter could be covered by fire from at least 2 and usually 3 different bunkers. An attacker could not find a gap, could not find an approach that was not covered. The defensive design was solid. Inside the fire base, the artillery battery was positioned in a star pattern with 5 guns arranged around a central gun. The central gun was used for firing illumination rounds during attacks and served as the main registration gun. The other 5 guns, 105mm M102 howitzers, were positioned in fortified firing positions surrounded by sandbag walls. These guns could fire in any direction, providing both indirect fire support for infantry operations outside the fire base and direct fire defense if the fire base itself came under attack. And crucially, FSB Crook was equipped with the latest technology available in 1969, sensors. The same ground sensors that had been developed for the McNamara line along the DMZ were deployed around FSB Crook. These sensors could detect movement, sound, even ground vibration from troops moving through the jungle. When activated, they transmitted signals back to monitoring equipment inside the fire base, giving the defenders early warning of approaching enemy forces. Radar. A ground surveillance radar was mounted on an observation tower inside FSB Crook. This radar could detect movement out to several kilometers, even through jungle canopy. It was especially effective at night when visual observation was impossible. The radar operators could track enemy formations as they approached, determining their size, direction, and speed. Starlight scopes. These early night vision devices were distributed to key positions around the perimeter. Soldiers manning machine guns and observers in bunkers could use the starlight scopes to see enemy troops moving at night, giving them the ability to engage targets that would have been invisible to the naked eye. And communications. FSB Crook had direct communications with every other fire base in range, with the artillery fire direction centers, with the tactical operations center at battalion and brigade level, and with the helicopter units and forward air controllers who could provide air support. When FSB Crook called for fire support, every available gun in the area would respond. This combination of prepared defenses, advanced technology, and overwhelming fire support made FSB Crook into what military planners in 1969 called an offensive fire base. A fire base designed not just to survive attacks, but to deliberately attract them so the attackers could be destroyed. The concept was simple. Build a fire base that looks vulnerable enough to tempt the enemy into attacking, but make it strong enough to withstand the attack, and surround it with enough sensors and firepower to turn the attack into a slaughter. In early June 1969, FSB Crook was ready. The defenses were prepared, the sensors were in place, the artillery was registered on every likely approach, the infantry knew their sectors, and intelligence reports indicated that 2 North Vietnamese regiments, the 271st and the 272nd, were operating in the area and preparing for offensive operations against Tay Ninh. All FSB Crook had to do was wait. The trap was set. The men defending Fire Support Base Crook in June 1969 belonged to Bravo Company, 3rd Battalion, 22nd Infantry Regiment. The 22nd Infantry was one of the oldest regiments in the United States Army, with a history dating back to 1866. Their nickname was the Walking Regulars, and by 1969 they had been fighting in Vietnam for 3 years as part of the 25th Infantry Division. The company commander was Captain Larry B. Thomas from Camp Hill, Pennsylvania. Thomas was an experienced infantry officer, and by June 1969 he had been in country long enough to know how to fight in Vietnam. He knew the enemy, he knew the terrain, and he knew his men. More importantly, his men knew him and trusted him. That trust would prove absolutely critical during the 3 nights of fighting that were about to begin. Bravo Company in June 1969 was a typical rifle company. On paper, about 120 men organized into 3 rifle platoons and a weapons platoon. In reality, probably closer to 90 or 100 men. Combat losses, soldiers on R&R, men on details, and the normal attrition of a rifle company in combat meant that units were rarely at full strength. But what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in experience. Many of the men in Bravo Company were veterans. Not just Vietnam veterans, but veterans of previous battles with the Walking Regulars. They had been on operations in War Zone C. They had conducted search and destroy missions. They had fought in night ambushes and defended other fire support bases. They knew how to fight. And they knew that defending a fire base at night against a determined enemy attack was one of the most dangerous missions in Vietnam. The fire base defense was organized by sectors. Each rifle platoon was responsible for a section of the perimeter. Within each platoon sector, squads occupied bunkers and fighting positions. Machine gun teams were positioned at key points where they could cover likely avenues of approach. Grenadiers with M79 grenade launchers were distributed throughout the perimeter to provide indirect fire support at close range, and reserve positions were identified where men could move if one part of the perimeter came under heavy attack. Every man knew his primary fighting position, his sector of fire, where the other men in his squad and platoon were located, where to go if his position was overrun, who to call for support if he saw enemy troops approaching. This level of preparation and familiarity with the defensive plan was not an accident. It was the result of training, rehearsals, and the hard-won experience of veterans who had done this before. The men carried standard infantry weapons. The M16 rifle, which by 1969 had largely replaced the earlier M14 in Vietnam. The M60 machine gun, the workhorse squad automatic weapon that provided the heavy firepower for each platoon. The M79 grenade launcher, which could lob 40mm grenades out to 300 or 400 meters. M72 Law rockets, the light anti-tank weapon, for use against bunkers or any armor that might appear. And fragmentation grenades, smoke grenades, and trip flares. The bunkers were stocked with ammunition, lots of ammunition, boxes of M16 magazines, belts of M60 ammunition, cases of M79 grenades, hand grenades stacked in every bunker, flares, smoke grenades, everything a defender might need during a sustained attack. Because once an attack started, resupply would be difficult, if not impossible. Each position had to have enough ammunition to fight through the entire night. Supporting Bravo Company was Alpha Battery, 7th Battalion, 11th Artillery. These were the artillerymen, and their 6 105mm howitzers were the backbone of FSB Crook's defensive firepower. The battery was commanded by an artillery captain and consisted of approximately 80 men organized into gun crews, fire direction control, and support personnel. The 105mm howitzer was a versatile weapon. It could fire high explosive shells out to 11 kilometers. It could fire illumination rounds that floated down on parachutes, lighting up the battlefield at night. It could fire smoke rounds. It could fire white phosphorus or Willie Pete, which was both an incendiary and marking round. And critically for fire-based defense, it could fire beehive rounds. The beehive round was one of the most devastating anti-personnel weapons ever developed. Each round contained thousands of small metal fléchettes, basically tiny steel darts. When fired, the round would burst open at a preset distance, usually just a few dozen meters from the muzzle, and spray these fléchettes in a cone pattern that covered a wide area. Anything in that cone, vegetation, equipment, human beings, would be shredded. The beehive round turned a howitzer into a giant shotgun, and when fired at attacking infantry at close range, it was absolutely devastating. But beehive rounds were not the only munitions Alpha Battery had available. They also had beaucoup amounts of high explosive shells. When FSB Crook called for fire support from other artillery batteries in the area, those batteries would fire HE shells at targets identified by the defenders. And the amount of artillery that could be brought to bear was staggering. Within range of FSB Crook were multiple other fire bases, each with their own batteries of 105mm and 155mm guns. When FSB Crook called for fire support, hundreds of guns would respond. The artillerymen at FSB Crook had a dual mission: provide fire support for infantry operations outside the firebase, and defend the firebase itself if it came under attack. They trained for both. They knew how to fire missions in support of infantry in contact miles away. And they knew how to depress their gun tubes, load beehive rounds, and fire directly at enemy troops assaulting their own perimeter. The gun crews had practiced these drills until they could do them in the dark, under fire, with mortars and rockets exploding around them. And they knew they would have to, because intelligence reports in early June 1969 indicated that the North Vietnamese were preparing for major offensive operations in Tay Ninh province. The 271st and 272nd NVA regiments had been identified in the area. Both were veteran units with extensive combat experience. Both had attacked American positions before, and both were known to be aggressive, well-trained, and willing to accept heavy casualties to achieve their objectives. The Americans at FSB Crook knew an attack was coming. The only questions were when, from which direction, and in what strength. And in early June 1969, they were about to get their answers. The forces preparing to attack Fire Support Base Crook in early June 1969 were among the best troops the North Vietnamese Army could field. The 271st and 272nd Infantry Regiments were regular North Vietnamese Army units, not Viet Cong guerrillas. These were professional soldiers, well-trained, well-equipped by communist standards, and experienced in attacking American positions. Each regiment consisted of 3 battalions of infantry, an artillery battalion, and support units. Total strength per regiment was around 2,000 men when fully manned, though combat losses, disease, and the difficulties of keeping units supplied in the field meant that actual strength was probably lower. But even at reduced strength, 2 NVA regiments represented a formidable force. Perhaps 3,000 or 4,000 combat troops supported by mortars, recoilless rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, and machine guns. The North Vietnamese had been fighting in this area for years. They knew the terrain intimately. They had base camps across the border in Cambodia, where they could rest, refit, and receive supplies without fear of American attack. And they had extensive intelligence on American positions, capabilities, and tactics. They knew FSB Crook was there. They knew approximately how many Americans were defending it, and they had decided to attack it. The NVA plan for attacking American fire bases had been refined over years of combat. It typically began with reconnaissance. Small teams would infiltrate close to the fire base, sometimes using those deliberately left patches of concealment that the Americans thought were so clever. They would observe American positions, count bunkers, identify gun emplacements, note patrol patterns, and look for weaknesses in the defensive perimeter. Then would come the preparatory fires. Mortars, usually 82mm or 120mm, would be positioned several kilometers away, where they could hit the firebase but were out of range of counter-battery fire. Rocket launchers, typically 122mm rockets or 107mm rockets, would be set up at various locations around the firebase. And recoilless rifles, large caliber weapons that could fire anti-tank rounds, would be positioned to hit bunkers and gun emplacements. When the attack began, the preparatory fires would hit the firebase from multiple directions simultaneously. The goal was to suppress the defenders, destroy bunkers and gun positions, create gaps in the wire, and generally create chaos and confusion. Under cover of this bombardment, sappers, specialist troops trained in breaching defenses, would move forward toward the wire. NVA sappers were among the most dangerous troops in their arsenal. These were volunteers, highly trained in demolitions and infiltration tactics. They typically attacked wearing only shorts or loincloths, their bodies covered in mud or charcoal to make them harder to see at night. They carried satchel charges, explosive devices designed to be thrown into bunkers or under vehicles. They carried Bangalore torpedoes, long pipes filled with explosives to blow gaps in barbed wire. And they carried AK-47 rifles or submachine guns for close quarters fighting. The sapper teams would try to breach the wire, neutralize bunkers, and create gaps in the defensive perimeter. Once gaps were created, the main assault forces would pour through. Battalion-sized formations of NVA infantry, organized into waves, would charge the American positions. The goal was to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers and violence. Get inside the perimeter. Engage the Americans in close quarters combat, where American firepower advantages were reduced. Destroy the artillery. Kill or capture the defenders. And overrun the firebase. This was the standard NVA playbook for attacking American firebases. And it had worked before. FSB Mary Ann would fall to a sapper attack in 1971. Other firebases had been overrun or badly damaged. The NVA knew how to do this. They had the training, the equipment, and the will to accept heavy casualties. But they had never attacked a firebase quite like FSB Crook. A firebase that was specifically designed to detect their approach. That had sensors and radar to spot them before they got close. That had fields of fire carefully cleared to maximize defensive firepower. That had artillery capable of firing beehive rounds point blank at charging infantry. And that could call on fire support from multiple other fire bases that would rain thousands of shells down on the attackers. The NVA commanders planning the attack on FSB Crook in early June 1969 may have thought they were attacking just another American fire base, a tempting target, a few hundred Americans isolated in enemy territory, an opportunity to inflict a significant defeat and demonstrate that American positions were vulnerable. What they were actually doing was walking into a meticulously prepared trap, and they were about to pay a terrible price for their mistake. The first indication that something was wrong came in the early afternoon of June 5th, 1969. The sensor operators at FSB Crook began receiving signals from the ground sensors deployed in the jungle around the firebase. Movement. Lots of movement. The radar on the observation tower began picking up contacts in the tree line. Multiple targets, moving slowly, heading toward the firebase from the northwest. Captain Larry Thomas was informed immediately. The intelligence picture was clear. A large enemy force was approaching FSB Crook, based on the number of contacts and the movement patterns, probably battalion strength or larger, and they were moving into position for an attack. Thomas ordered his men to full alert. Every bunker was manned. Extra ammunition was distributed. The artillery battery was notified. Fire support from other bases was prearranged, and everyone waited. The sun set around 7 p.m. As darkness fell, the tension at FSB Crook was thick enough to cut with a knife. Around 3 in the morning on June 6th, the attack began. First came the preparatory bombardment. The night erupted in noise and fire as dozens of mortar rounds and rockets slammed into FSB Crook. 82mm mortars, 120mm mortars, 107mm rockets. The NVA had positioned multiple firing positions around the fire base, and they opened up simultaneously. The explosions walked across the fire base. Bunkers shook under the impacts. Sandbags were blown apart. Equipment was destroyed. The Americans huddled in their bunkers as the barrage continued. Incoming rounds screamed in with that distinctive rising whistle that every combat veteran learned to recognize and fear. Then the explosions, dirt and shrapnel flying everywhere, the concussion waves hitting like physical blows. But the bunkers held. The overhead cover that the engineers had built was thick enough. The sandbag walls absorbed the shrapnel, and the Americans stayed in their protected positions, waiting for the barrage to lift, because they knew what was coming next. As the mortar and rocket fire shifted deeper into the fire base, concentrating on the artillery positions and command bunkers, the assault began. From the south and east, hundreds of NVA soldiers emerged from the tree line and began moving toward the American perimeter. First came the sappers, crawling through the elephant grass toward the wire barriers. But the sensors had already detected them. The radar operators watching their screens could see the movement. And Captain Thomas had already called in illumination rounds. High overhead, parachute flares ignited and began their slow descent, casting harsh white light across the battlefield. The sappers, caught in the open, were suddenly visible. Machine guns opened fire. M60s in the bunkers began hammering out bursts of 7.62 millimeter rounds. Tracers reached out toward the crawling sappers like red fingers of death. Some of the sappers were hit immediately and went down. Others tried to crawl faster, to reach the wire before the American gunners could zero in on them. They didn't make it. The American defensive fire was too heavy, too accurate, and it was about to get much worse. Sergeant First Class Donald Neal from Columbus, Georgia, saw sappers approaching his sector. Without hesitation, he grabbed 2 M79 grenade launchers and several bandoliers of ammunition and moved to a position where he had a clear field of fire. Together with another soldier, they began lobbing 40mm grenades at the sappers. The grenades arced through the air and exploded among the attackers, each one sending deadly shrapnel in all directions. The sappers who weren't hit immediately began crawling backward, trying to escape the kill zone. But there was no escape, because now the artillery was joining the fight. Alpha Battery had been waiting for this. The gun crews loaded beehive rounds into their 105mm howitzers. They depressed the gun tubes to minimum elevation, essentially pointing them horizontally, and they fired. The beehive rounds burst just meters from the muzzles, spraying thousands of steel flechettes across the area where the NVA assault was forming up. The flechettes, each one like a tiny steel dart, shredded everything in their path. Trees were stripped of bark, vegetation was cut down, and human bodies were torn apart. 76 North Vietnamese soldiers died in that initial barrage of beehive rounds. The assault from the south broke before it even reached the wire. The survivors, shocked and bleeding, pulled back into the jungle. The sappers who had tried to breach the perimeter were dead or dying in the cleared area in front of the wire. But the attack was not over. From other directions, more NVA troops were attempting to assault the fire base. The 272nd Regiment was throwing its weight into the attack, trying to find a weak point, trying to get through the American defenses. They found nothing but more fire. Cobra gunships called in from nearby bases began making gun runs on the NVA positions in the tree line. Their miniguns poured thousands of rounds into the jungle. Their rockets exploded in the enemy staging areas. Tactical airstrikes were called in. F-4 Phantom jets screamed overhead and dropped bombs and napalm on suspected enemy positions. And the artillery? Oh, the artillery. Not just from FSB Crook itself, but from every fire base in range. FSB Washington, 2.5 miles north of Tay Ninh City. Other fire bases positioned throughout the area. All of them received fire missions from FSB Crook. All of them responded. Hundreds of high explosive shells rained down on the NVA assembly areas, withdrawal routes, and suspected command posts. The night turned into a hurricane of fire and steel. Illumination rounds floated overhead on parachutes, casting their eerie light over the battlefield. High explosive rounds detonated in the jungle with massive orange fireballs. Tracer rounds from machine guns and helicopter miniguns laced through the darkness like deadly fireworks. The noise was continuous and overwhelming. Inside FSB Crook, Captain Thomas moved along the bunker line, checking on his men, making sure every sector was covered, directing fire to where it was needed most. He would later say that his men knew what to do before he even had to direct them. They performed beyond expectations, and he was proud of every one of them. Specialist 4, Richard C. Marroquin from Floresville, Texas, was manning an M60 machine gun in a bunker on the northeast section of the perimeter where the initial attack had been fairly light. As sappers tried to infiltrate from that direction, Marroquin made an immediate assessment of the situation. He turned his M60 toward the threat and opened fire. The heavy machine gun hammered out bursts, and the tracers showed him exactly where his rounds were going. The sappers who had been crawling toward the wire were cut down. The desperate NVA forces answered with a wave of rocket-propelled grenades. RPGs whooshed through the air and slammed into the bunker line. But Bravo Company had constructed their fortifications well. The bunkers were thick. The overhead cover held. The sandbag. Walls absorbed the impacts. And the Americans inside kept fighting. The battle raged for hours. Attack after attack was thrown at the fire base. And attack after attack was broken by the combination of prepared defenses, disciplined fire control, and overwhelming firepower. At no time during the entire night did the NVA succeed in breaching the bunker line. The wire held. The defensive perimeter remained intact. And as dawn approached, the NVA forces began to withdraw. As the sun came up on June 6th, the Americans could see the results of the night's fighting. The area around FSB Crook looked like a slaughterhouse. Bodies in the wire, bodies in the cleared areas. Blood trails leading back into the jungle where wounded had been dragged away. Abandoned weapons, discarded equipment. The NVA had taken a beating. Sweeps of the area around the fire base, conducted by other companies of the 3rd 22nd Infantry and helicopters from the 187th Assault Helicopter Company, found more bodies and more evidence of the devastation the Americans had inflicted. The body count for the first night reached 76, confirmed NVA killed, and the Americans had suffered no killed in action and only a few wounded. But Captain Thomas and his men knew it was not over. The NVA had committed major forces to this attack. They had taken heavy casualties, but had not achieved their objective. And the North Vietnamese were not known for giving up after one failed attempt. Everyone at FSB Crook knew the enemy would be back. The only questions were when and with how many troops. The answer came the next night. The day of June 6th was spent preparing for the next attack. Ammunition was resupplied. Damaged bunkers were repaired. Additional defensive measures were put in place. And intelligence reports confirmed what everyone suspected. The NVA were regrouping for another assault, and this time they were bringing fresh units into the fight. The 88th NVA Regiment had been identified moving toward the area. This was a 3rd regiment, in addition to the 271st and 272nd that had attacked the previous night. The North Vietnamese were doubling down. They had taken heavy casualties, but apparently believed they could overwhelm FSB Crook through sheer weight of numbers. They were about to discover they were wrong. The second night's attack began much like the first, a heavy bombardment of mortars and rockets starting around midnight. But this time, the NVA commitment was even larger. Intelligence estimates put the attacking force at over 430 men just from the 88th Regiment, attacking from the northeast and northwest. Combined with elements from the other regiments still in the area, the total attack force may have numbered 600 or 700 troops. Against them stood approximately 100 infantry from Bravo Company and 80 artillerymen from Alpha Battery. The odds were roughly 4-1 in favor of the attackers. But the Americans had the advantage of prepared positions, superior firepower, and the experience of having fought off an attack the previous night. They knew what to expect, they knew what worked, and they were ready. The NVA assault came in waves. The tactics were the same as the previous night. Preparatory fires to suppress the defenders, sappers attempting to breach the wire, main assault forces following behind to exploit any gaps. But this time, the Americans were even more prepared. As soon as the mortar barrage began, Captain Thomas had already called for fire support from every available asset. Artillery from multiple fire bases began pounding suspected NVA staging areas even before the assault troops left the tree line. Illumination rounds were fired continuously, keeping the battlefield lit up throughout the night. And the Cobra gunships, along with Spooky and Shadow gunships, were already airborne and ready to provide immediate fire support. Spooky was the AC-47, the converted cargo plane mounting 3 side-firing miniguns. Shadow was the AC-119, a larger gunship with even more firepower. When these aircraft opened fire, their miniguns could fire 6,000 rounds per minute per gun. The stream of tracers looked like a solid red line reaching down from the sky. Every fifth round was a tracer, which meant for every red streak visible, there were 4 invisible bullets in between. The firepower was unbelievable. As the NVA assault forces began their charge toward the firebase, they ran into the same wall of fire that had destroyed the previous night's attack. Machine gun fire from the bunkers, grenade launchers lobbing 40mm grenades, and the artillery firing beehive rounds point blank into the attacking formations. The carnage was even worse than the previous night because the NVA had committed more troops to a smaller area. The beehive rounds from Alpha Battery scythed through the packed assault formations like a giant lawnmower. The steel flechettes tore through multiple human bodies, each round killing or wounding dozens of men. The NVA kept coming, kept charging, wave after wave, but they could not get through the defensive fires. Lieutenant Curtis McFarland from Midland, Texas, commanded one of the platoons defending a critical sector of the perimeter. As he saw sappers attempting to breach the wire in his area, he readied his men and called for artillery support. The sappers were stopped before they could create any gaps. And when the main assault force tried to follow them, they ran straight into concentrated fire from McFarland's platoon and the artillery battery. Throughout the night, Captain Thomas ran back and forth along the bunker line, moving from position to position, assessing where the greatest threats were developing, directing additional firepower to those sectors. He would later say that he never had to direct his men because they knew what to do before he had a chance to tell them. They performed beyond his expectations. And once again, the firebase's defensive design proved its worth. The concentric cleared circles at 150 meters and 300 meters forced the NVA assault forces to cross open ground under fire. The sensors and radar detected every movement. The illumination rounds kept the battlefield lit. And the interlocking fields of fire from the bunkers meant there was no safe approach to the American perimeter. The NVA commanders tried different tactics. They attempted to concentrate their assault on a single point, hoping to achieve a breakthrough through sheer weight of numbers. But the Americans simply shifted their fires to meet each new threat. They tried to attack from multiple directions simultaneously to divide the American defensive fires. But FSB Crook had enough firepower to engage multiple threats at once, and the air support was relentless. The Cobra gunships made gun after gun run, their pilots expertly placing rockets and minigun fire exactly where the ground commanders needed it. The AC-47 Spooky and AC-119 Shadow gunships orbited overhead all night, their sensors detecting NVA movements and their miniguns engaging any concentration of enemy troops. The battle raged for hours. The NVA threw themselves at the firebase again and again, accepting horrific casualties, trying to break through. But they never did. At no point during the entire second night did the NVA breach the bunker line. The defensive perimeter held, and as dawn approached, the surviving NVA forces broke off the attack and withdrew. When daylight came, the scene around FSB Crook was even worse than after the first night. Hundreds of bodies. The cleared areas in front of the wire were carpeted with dead and dying NVA soldiers. The jungle was shattered from the thousands of artillery rounds and airstrikes. The stench of death hung over everything. Alpha Company of the 3rd 22nd Infantry was air assaulted into an area 4 kilometers north of FSB Crook to cut off the NVA retreat and search for enemy headquarters elements. They followed trails of communication wire left by the retreating NVA and ran head-on into what appeared to be a regimental headquarters. First Lieutenant William Irvin from Richmond, Virginia, commanded Alpha Company and called for tactical airstrikes while maneuvering his men against the enemy. The fighting was sharp and close range, but darkness forced Alpha Company to break contact and return to FSB Washington before they could determine the full extent of enemy casualties. Meanwhile, Bravo Company left their bunkers at FSB Crook to sweep the immediate area. As they moved through the battlefield, they were greeted by NVA soldiers hiding in well-camouflaged spider holes who threw hand grenades at the advancing Americans. Bravo Company pulled back and called in Spooky to hose down the area with minigun fire. Once the area was cleared, they resumed their sweep and began, the grim task of counting bodies and collecting weapons. The body count for the second night was staggering. 323 confirmed NVA killed, 10 prisoners taken, hundreds more estimated wounded and carried away by the retreating forces. Against this, the Americans at FSB Crook had suffered 1 killed in action and 7 wounded. The exchange ratio was approaching 100 to 1. The battalion commander, speaking to reporters after the second night's battle, was proud of his entire unit. He said that everybody reacted to perfection to defeat the enemy force. They had one hell of a battle on their hands, and it directly involved the entire battalion. The support elements provided everything they needed as fast as it could possibly be done. Alpha, Charlie, and Delta, companies all got into the action at Crook by sweeping the surrounding woodlines after the battle. Even the recon platoon was out there clearing away bodies and counting captured weapons. He was proud of every man in the unit, and especially proud of those men in Bravo Company who pushed back 2 NVA regiments in 2 nights. But incredibly, unbelievably, the NVA came back for a third night. On the evening of June 7, 1969, the men at Fire Support Base Crook prepared once again for an attack. They had now fought off 2 major assaults in 2 consecutive nights. They had killed approximately 400 North Vietnamese soldiers. They had captured 10 prisoners and dozens of weapons. And they had proved beyond any doubt that FSB Crook was not going to fall to an NVA attack. But the North Vietnamese apparently had not learned the lesson. Or perhaps they felt they could not afford to stop attacking without achieving some kind of victory to justify their enormous casualties. Or perhaps the political officers and commanders at higher levels ordered the local units to attack again regardless of the costs. Whatever the reason, intelligence reports indicated that the NVA were preparing for a third assault. The third night's attack was smaller in scale than the previous 2 nights, but no less determined. The NVA forces hit FSB Crook again, launching another ground assault accompanied by mortars and rockets. This time, the battle raged for 2 hours and 10 minutes, and once again, the result was the same. The Americans at FSB Crook were now veterans of firebase defense. They had done this twice already. They knew exactly what to expect. They knew their sectors. They knew where to direct their fires. They knew when to call for artillery support and airstrikes. They were a well-oiled machine, and the NVA assault ran straight into that machine. The defensive fires were devastating. Machine guns, grenade launchers, beehive rounds from the artillery, supporting fires from other fire bases, airstrikes, light fire teams, pairs of helicopters working together with one illuminating targets and the other engaging them, spooky and shadow gunships, everything in the American arsenal was thrown at the attackers. Captain Thomas directed his company with the same energy and leadership he had shown the previous 2 nights. His men fought with the same determination and skill. The artillery crews loaded and fired until their gun tubes were too hot to touch. The forward observers called in mission after mission, and the NVA assault broke against the defensive perimeter like waves against a rock. When the sun came up on June 8th, the third attack had been repulsed. More bodies added to the piles around the fire base, more weapons captured, more evidence of the absolute futility of attacking a well-prepared American defensive position. The final tally after 3 consecutive nights of fighting was stunning. 400 North Vietnamese soldiers confirmed killed, probably twice that many wounded. 3 NVA regiments, the 271st, the 272nd, and the 88th, all committed to the attacks, all defeated, all forced to withdraw with catastrophic casualties. Against this, Fire Support Base Crook had suffered 1 American killed in action and 8 wounded over the 3 nights of fighting. 1 dead versus 400. The exchange ratio was 400 to 1. It was one of the most lopsided victories of the entire Vietnam War, and it proved beyond any doubt that the concept of the offensive firebase worked. Build a strong defensive position. Equip it with sensors and modern technology. Give it overwhelming firepower, and use it as bait to lure the enemy into attacking so that firepower can destroy them. The Battle of Fire Support. Base Crook demonstrated several aspects of modern warfare that the United States military had refined over years of fighting in Vietnam. The combination of technology, firepower, and tactics that produced the 400 to 1 exchange ratio was not an accident. It was the result of deliberate planning, proper training, and the integration of multiple weapon systems into a cohesive defensive concept. The sensors were critical. The ground sensors buried around FSB Crook gave early warning of approaching enemy forces. Without that early warning, the defenders might have been surprised and not had time to prepare. With the sensors, they knew hours in advance that an attack was coming, and from which direction. This allowed Captain Thomas to position his forces optimally and to call for fire support before the battle even began. The radar was equally important. The ground surveillance radar mounted on the observation tower could track enemy movements even at night and through jungle canopy. The radar operators could see enemy formations massing, could track their movements, and could call in artillery fire on those formations before they even reached the firebase perimeter. This preemptive fire caused casualties before the battle started and disrupted enemy assault formations. The starlight scopes gave the Americans the ability to see at night. Previous generations of soldiers fighting at night were essentially blind except for illumination from flares or fires. With starlight scopes, machine gunners and observers could see enemy troops moving in the darkness and engage them accurately. This technology gave the defenders a tremendous advantage because the attackers did not have equivalent night vision capabilities. The cleared fields of fire were essential. The engineers who bulldozed those concentric circles around FSB Crook created kill zones where attacking infantry had to cross open ground under observation and fire. The NVA assault forces could not use terrain for concealment. They could not infiltrate close to the wire through vegetation. They had to cross those cleared areas, and when they did, they were exposed to defensive fires. The artillery was the devastating centerpiece of the defense. The 105mm howitzers of Alpha Battery could fire in any direction, providing both indirect fire at long range and direct fire at point-blank range. When firing beehive rounds horizontally at attacking infantry formations, each gun became a massive shotgun that could kill dozens of men with a single round. The artillery crews at FSB Crook fired hundreds of rounds over the 3 nights of battle, and their accuracy and rate of fire were critical to breaking the NVA assaults. But Alpha Battery was not fighting alone. Fire support from other artillery batteries in the area was integrated into the defensive plan. When FSB Crook called for fire missions, batteries at FSB Washington, FSB Buell, FSB Mitchell, and other locations all responded. The fire direction centers coordinated these fires so that shells from multiple batteries would impact simultaneously on target. This created a devastating barrage that the NVA forces could not survive. The concept was called mutual fire support. Fire bases were positioned close enough to each other that their artillery could cover each other. If one fire base was attacked, every other fire base in range would provide fire support. This meant that even a small fire base like FSB Crook, with only 6 guns organic to its garrison, could call on the fires of dozens of guns when needed. The amount of steel that could be dropped on attacking enemy forces was astronomical. The air support was integrated seamlessly into the defensive fires. The Cobra helicopter gunships provided immediate response to threats. They could see the battlefield from above, could identify enemy positions, and could engage those positions with rockets and miniguns within minutes of being called. The pilots worked directly with the ground commanders, receiving target information and putting ordnance exactly where it was needed. The fixed-wing gunships, the AC-47 Spooky and AC-119 Shadow, provided a different kind of fire support. These aircraft could orbit over the battlefield for hours, their sensors detecting enemy movements and their miniguns engaging any concentration of troops. The psychological effect of these gunships was enormous. The NVA soldiers called the AC-47 the Dragon because of the way its minigun fire looked like a tongue of flame reaching down from the sky. And they feared it, because there was nowhere to hide when the Dragon was overhead. Tactical airstrikes from fighter bombers added another layer of firepower. F-4 Phantom jets and F-100 Super Sabres could be called in to drop bombs, napalm, and cluster munitions on enemy positions outside the immediate defensive perimeter. These strikes were particularly effective against enemy staging areas and withdrawal routes, catching NVA forces as they assembled for attacks or retreated after being repulsed. The integration of all these weapon systems, sensors, artillery, helicopter gunships, fixed-wing gunships, and tactical air, into a coordinated defensive plan was what made the difference. Each system complemented the others. The sensors detected the enemy. The radar tracked them. The artillery engaged them. The air support hit them from above. And the infantry in the bunkers finished off anyone who survived to reach the perimeter. It was combined arms warfare at its finest. The tactics used by the Americans at FSB Crook were also important. The defensive positions were mutually supporting. No bunker fought alone. Each bunker could cover its neighbors and be covered in return. This meant that even if one position was temporarily suppressed, adjacent positions could continue to engage the enemy and prevent a breakthrough. The use of illumination was constant. Parachute flares were fired throughout the night, keeping the battlefield lit so that the defenders could see the attackers and engage them accurately. This denied the NVA the advantage of darkness and forced them to attack across lit terrain where every movement could be seen. The fire control was disciplined. Despite the chaos and violence of the attacks, the Americans did not simply blast away wildly. They identified targets. They called for specific fire missions. They adjusted fires based on results. This disciplined approach conserved ammunition and maximized effectiveness. And the leadership was superb. Captain Thomas and his officers and NCOs kept control of the situation throughout all 3 nights of battle. They moved along the perimeter, checking on their men. They shifted forces to meet threats. They called for fire support when needed. They made decisions quickly and correctly. Good leadership made the difference between a successful defense and a disaster. The NVA, for their part, showed tremendous courage in pressing their attacks despite horrific casualties. The assault troops kept charging even after seeing their comrades cut down in front of them. The sappers kept trying to breach the wire, even though it was essentially a suicide mission. This kind of determination was characteristic of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces throughout the war. They were willing to accept casualties that would have broken most armies. But courage alone was not enough. Without the technology, without the firepower, without the proper tactics, the NVA could not overcome the American defenses. And the Battle of FSB Crook demonstrated that when American forces chose their ground, prepared properly, and had adequate support, they were essentially unstoppable. After 3 consecutive nights of fighting, the North Vietnamese forces in the area around Fire Support Base Crook were finished as an effective combat force. The 271st, 272nd, and 88th NVA regiments had all been committed to the attacks. All had taken catastrophic casualties. All had failed to achieve their objective. 400 confirmed dead was just the beginning of the NVA losses. The standard military estimate is that for every soldier killed in combat, 3 or 4 more are wounded. If that ratio held at FSB Crook, and there is every reason to believe it did, then the NVA suffered somewhere between 1,200 and 1,600 wounded, in addition to the 400 dead. Total casualties of 1,600 to 2,000 men, out of an attacking force of perhaps 4,000 or 5,000. Casualty rates approaching 40 or 50%. Those are catastrophic losses. Units that suffer 40% casualties are typically considered combat ineffective and need to be pulled out of the line to rest and refit. The NVA regiments that attacked FSB Crook were not just combat ineffective, they were shattered. It would take months to replace the dead and wounded, to reorganize the units, to restore morale, and to make them ready to fight again. The captured weapons told part of the story. AK-47 assault rifles, RPD and RPK light machine guns, RPG launchers, recoilless rifles, mortars, rockets, all abandoned by the retreating NVA forces. The amount of equipment captured indicated the panic and desperation of the withdrawal. Soldiers do not abandon their weapons lightly. They only do so when they are fleeing for their lives and cannot carry anything extra. The prisoners captured during and after the battle provided valuable intelligence. Interrogations revealed the identity of the units involved, their strength, their commanders, and their objectives. The prisoners confirmed that the attacks on FSB Crook were part of a larger North Vietnamese offensive planned for Tay Ninh province. The goal had been to attack and overrun American fire bases, disrupt American operations, and eventually take Tay Ninh City itself. But the catastrophic failure at FSB Crook forced the NVA to abandon those plans. The forces that were supposed to continue offensive operations had been destroyed. The timeline for the offensive had been disrupted. and the psychological impact of such a one-sided defeat could not be ignored. The NVA soldiers who survived the attacks at FSB Crook would carry the memory of that defeat with them, and they would be far more cautious about attacking American fire bases in the future. For the Americans, the Battle of FSB Crook was a textbook success. The concept of the offensive firebase had been validated. The integration of sensors, radar, artillery, and air power had proved effective. The training and leadership of the infantry and artillery units had been demonstrated. And the casualties, 1 killed and 8 wounded, were remarkably light given the intensity of the fighting. The 1 American killed in the 3 nights of battle was mourned by his comrades. His name is remembered by the veterans of Bravo Company and Alpha Battery who were there, and his sacrifice, along with the courage of all the men who fought at FSB Crook, should never be forgotten. The 8 wounded all recovered from their injuries and returned to duty. The wounds were relatively minor, mostly from shrapnel from the NVA mortar and rocket bombardments. Given that FSB Crook took hundreds of mortar and rocket rounds over 3 nights, the fact that only 8 men were wounded was a testament to the quality of the defensive construction. The bunkers saved lives, the overhead cover worked, the defensive design was sound. In the days following the battle, other companies of the 3rd Battalion, 22nd Infantry, conducted extensive sweeps of the area around FSB Crook. They searched for more bodies, for caches of weapons and equipment, for wounded NVA soldiers, and for any intelligence that could be gathered. The sweeps confirmed the extent of the NVA defeat. Everywhere they looked, they found evidence of the slaughter. Blood trails, discarded equipment, hastily dug graves. The NVA had tried to carry away as many of their dead and wounded as possible, but the sheer number of casualties overwhelmed their ability to do so. The intelligence gathered from the battle was valuable at the strategic level as well. It confirmed that the NVA were still willing to commit large forces to offensive operations, even after the failures of the Tet Offensive in 1968. It showed that the NVA would accept enormous casualties in pursuit of their objectives, and it demonstrated that properly defended American fire bases were essentially invulnerable to NVA attacks, no matter how large the attacking force might be. General Crichton Abrams, the commander of American forces in Vietnam, visited Tay Ninh shortly after the battle. On June 13th, just a week after the fighting at FSB Crook, he awarded Presidential Unit citations to 5 battalions for their performance in recent operations. He said that the men of the 25th Infantry Division stood tall and looked proud, and with good reason. Their actions in June, including the defense of FSB Crook, had been exemplary. The victory at FSB Crook did not end the war. The fighting in Tay Ninh province continued. Other fire bases would be attacked. Other battles would be fought. Men would continue to die. But for 3 nights in early June 1969, the men of Bravo Company and Alpha Battery had demonstrated exactly what American forces could do when they were properly prepared, properly equipped, and properly led. They had held the line against overwhelming odds. They had killed 400 enemy soldiers while losing only 1 of their own, and they had proved that courage, discipline, and firepower could overcome any assault. To understand the Battle of Fire Support Base Crook, it helps to understand the unit that fought there. The 25th Infantry Division, nicknamed Tropic Lightning, had a long and distinguished history. Formed in Hawaii in 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor, the division had fought throughout World War II in the Pacific. Guadalcanal, New Georgia, Luzon, they had been there. And they had earned a reputation as tough, aggressive fighters. In Vietnam, the 25th Infantry Division arrived in early 1966 and immediately began operations in the area northwest of Saigon. Their area of operations included Cu Chi, where they established their base camp, Tay Ninh Province, War Zone C, and the border areas near Cambodia. It was some of the most dangerous territory in South Vietnam. Heavy jungle, enemy base camps, supply routes, and a hostile population that often supported the Viet Cong. The division's insignia was a yellow lightning bolt on a red taro leaf. The taro leaf represented their Hawaii origins. The lightning bolt represented their speed and striking power. And the nickname Tropic Lightning was known throughout Vietnam. The NVA and Viet Cong knew the division well. They had fought the 25th many times, and they had learned to respect their capabilities. By 1969, the 25th Infantry Division was a veteran organization. Most of the officers and NCOs had combat experience. Many of the enlisted men had been in country for 6 months or more and knew how to fight in Vietnam. The division had refined its tactics, learned from its mistakes, and developed effective methods for dealing with the enemy. The division's area of operations in June 1969 stretched from the Cambodian border to the outskirts of Saigon. This was critical real estate. If the North Vietnamese could control this area, they could threaten the South Vietnamese capital directly. If the Americans could control it, they could keep the NVA and Viet Cong at arm's length and protect Saigon from attack. The strategy the division employed was based on fire support bases, instead of trying to control all the territory all the time, which was impossible given the size of the area and the number of troops available. The division established a network of fire bases positioned to cover key terrain and enemy infiltration routes. Infantry companies would operate out of these fire bases, conducting patrols, ambushes, and search and destroy missions. And the artillery at the fire bases provided fire support for those operations. This strategy had several advantages. It allowed relatively small numbers of American troops to influence large areas. It kept the artillery mobile and able to support operations anywhere in the division's area, and it forced the NVA to either avoid the areas around the fire bases or attack them, which, as FSB Crook demonstrated, was a losing proposition for the attackers. The 25th Infantry Division in 1969 consisted of 3 brigades, each with its own area of operations. The 1st Brigade operated in the Tay Ninh area, which is where FSB Crook was located. The 2nd Brigade operated further south near Cu Chi, and the 3rd Brigade operated in the Hoang Hia Province area. Each brigade had multiple infantry battalions, artillery battalions, and supporting units. The 3rd Battalion, 22nd Infantry, the unit that defended FSB Crook, was part of the 1st Brigade. The battalion had 4 rifle companies, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Delta, plus a headquarters company and supporting units. In June 1969, the battalion was operating throughout the Tay Ninh area, with different companies assigned to different fire bases and conducting operations in different sectors. The battalion commander in June 1969 was a lieutenant colonel whose leadership and tactical ability were demonstrated by his unit's performance. When he said after the battle that he was proud of every man in the unit, and especially proud of those men in Bravo Company who pushed back 2 NVA regiments in 2 nights, he meant it, and his men had earned that pride. The 7th Battalion, 11th Artillery, the parent unit of Alpha Battery, was the direct support artillery battalion for the 1st Brigade. Their mission was to provide artillery fire support for all 1st Brigade operations. In June 1969, the battalion had batteries positioned at multiple fire bases throughout the area. Alpha Battery at FSB Crook, other batteries at FSB Washington, FSB Buell, and other locations, all connected by radio and all able to support each other with overlapping fields of fire. The integration between the infantry and artillery was seamless. The forward observers who accompanied the infantry companies were artillery officers trained to call in fire missions. They knew how to adjust fire. They knew what types of ammunition to request for different targets. And they were skilled at bringing artillery fire danger close to friendly troops when necessary. This integration was critical to the success at FSB Crook. When Captain Thomas needed fire support, he could call Alpha Battery and have shells on target within minutes. When he needed support from other batteries, the fire direction centers would coordinate the missions and deliver simultaneous impacts from multiple guns. This level of coordination and responsiveness was the result of training, experience, and good communications. The 25th Infantry Division's performance in June 1969 was exemplary across the board. In addition to the battle at FSB Crook, other units of the division fought successful engagements throughout Tay Ninh Province. The 4th Battalion, 9th Infantry, the Manchus, fought at Frontier City and killed 213 NVA without losing a single American. The 4th Battalion, 23rd Infantry, the Tomahawks, engaged NVA forces near Tay Ninh City and Nui Baden Mountain. The 3rd Squadron, 4th Cavalry, the Raiders, ambushed an NVA regiment and killed 98 enemy soldiers. All of these actions were part of a coordinated campaign to disrupt North Vietnamese offensive plans in Tay Ninh Province. The NVA had been preparing for a major push against Tay Ninh City. They had positioned multiple regiments in the area. They had stockpiled ammunition and supplies. They had planned coordinated attacks on American fire bases and South Vietnamese positions, and the 25th Infantry Division systematically defeated all of those plans. The NVA did manage to launch some attacks. FSB Washington, just north of Tay Ninh City, was attacked on June 19th by sappers and infantry, but like FSB Crook, Washington beat off the attack and killed 35 NVA soldiers. The Cu Chi base camp and Dao Tieng base camp both took rocket attacks, but the damage was minimal and the attackers were driven off. By the end of June 1969, the NVA offensive in Tay Ninh province had been decisively defeated. The 25th Infantry Division had killed over 1,500 enemy soldiers in the month of June alone. They had captured hundreds of weapons. They had disrupted enemy supply lines and base camps, and they had protected Tay Ninh City and the approaches to Saigon from enemy attack. The cost to the division was relatively light. Dozens of Americans killed and hundreds wounded over the course of the month's operations. Tragic losses for the families and units involved, but remarkably low given the intensity of the fighting and the size of the enemy forces engaged. The 25th Infantry Division would continue to operate in this area until American forces began withdrawing from Vietnam in 1970 and 1971. The division would participate in the Cambodian incursion in 1970, and individual units would continue to fight until the division began standing down and returning to the United States in late 1970 and early 1971. But the Battle of Fire Support Base Crook in June 1969 represented the 25th Infantry Division at its best. Well-trained soldiers, aggressive leadership, integrated combined arms, and an absolute determination to win. Those 3 nights in June showed what the division could do, and showed why they earned the name Tropic Lightning. The concept of the Fire Support Base was one of the major tactical innovations of the Vietnam War. To understand why FSB Crook was built the way it was, and why it functioned the way it did, it helps to understand how fire support bases evolved during the course of the war. In the early years of American involvement in Vietnam, artillery support for infantry operations was provided from major base camps. Artillery batteries would be positioned at places like Bien Hoa, Cu Chi, or other large permanent installations. Infantry units would operate within range of those batteries and call for fire support as needed. But this approach had significant limitations. The range of artillery was limited, typically 11 kilometers for 105mm howitzers and 14 kilometers for 155mm howitzers. If infantry units operated beyond that range, they had no artillery support, and much of the territory in Vietnam, where combat operations were needed, was far from the major base camps. The solution was to create temporary forward artillery positions. A battery of guns would be helicoptered or trucked to a location closer to where the infantry was operating. A hasty perimeter would be established. The guns would be set up and registered, and they would provide fire support for several days before moving to a new location. The first true fire support base in Vietnam was FSB Bill, established by the 1st Cavalry Division in 1965 in Pleiku Province. It was a temporary position, occupied for just a few days during Operation Silver Bayonet, but it proved the concept. Artillery could be moved rapidly to support maneuver forces, and those artillery positions could be defended by relatively small infantry forces if properly dug in. Over time, the concept evolved. Fire support bases began lasting longer. Instead of 2 or 3 days, they might be occupied for 2 or 3 weeks. The defensive perimeters became more elaborate. Instead of hasty fighting positions, engineers would build proper bunkers with overhead cover. Wire obstacles would be emplaced. Fields of fire would be cleared. Ammunition would be stockpiled. By 1967 and 1968, fire support bases had become semi-permanent installations. Some would be occupied for months. They would have landing pads for helicopters, tactical operations centers, aid stations, supply points. They became miniature forts scattered throughout the Vietnamese countryside, projecting American firepower and protecting American infantry operations. But they also became targets. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong quickly realized that these isolated American positions were vulnerable to attack, and they began developing tactics specifically for attacking fire support bases: the sapper attacks, the massed infantry assaults, the preparatory bombardments, all designed to overwhelm the defenders and destroy the fire base. Some fire bases fell to these attacks. FSB Mary Ann would be overrun in 1971 with heavy American casualties. Other fire bases were badly damaged or had to be evacuated under pressure. The NVA proved they could attack these positions effectively if the Americans were not careful. But the Americans learned from these experiences, and by 1969, fire support base design and defense had become quite sophisticated. The bunkers were stronger, the wire auss was thicker, the fields of fire were better prepared, the use of sensors and radar gave early warning, and the availability of rapid fire support from other fire bases and from air assets made it much more difficult for the NVA to successfully attack. FSB Crook represented the culmination of this evolution. It was not just a fire base. It was a deliberate trap designed to attract enemy attacks so they could be destroyed. The defensive design was not just adequate, it was overwhelming, and the firepower available was not just sufficient, it was devastating. The concept of the offensive firebase, the decoy firebase, was developed specifically to deal with the NVA offensive in 1969. American commanders knew the North Vietnamese were planning attacks. Intelligence reports indicated major enemy forces moving into position. The question was how to deal with those forces. One option was to try to find them in the jungle and destroy them with search and destroy operations. But the jungle was thick, the enemy was elusive, and search and destroy missions often resulted in American casualties from ambushes without inflicting major enemy losses. The other option was to let the enemy come to the Americans. Build strong defensive positions. Make them attractive targets. And when the enemy attacked, destroy them with superior firepower. This was the decoy firebase concept, and FSB Crook proved it worked. The keys to making it work were preparation and firepower. The preparation included everything already described: the cleared fields of fire, the strong bunkers, the sensors and radar, the defensive planning. Without proper preparation, a fire base was just a target waiting to be destroyed. The firepower included not just the guns inside the fire base, but all the supporting fires that could be brought to bear. Other artillery batteries, helicopter gunships, fixed-wing gunships, tactical airstrikes. The ability to mass fires from multiple sources on the attacking enemy was what made the difference between a successful defense and a disaster. And it required confidence. The Americans inside FSB Crook had to believe they could hold against whatever the NVA threw at them. They had to trust their defenses, their weapons, their training, and each other. That confidence came from preparation and from leadership. Captain Thomas and the other leaders at FSB Crook inspired that confidence in their men, and the men delivered. After the success at FSB Crook, the concept was used elsewhere in Vietnam. Other decoy fire bases were established in 1969 and 1970. Some were attacked and successfully defended. Others were not attacked because the NVA, having learned the lesson at places like FSB Crook, decided the cost was too high. By 1970, as American forces began withdrawing from Vietnam under Vietnamization, the firebase concept evolved again. Fire bases became smaller and more mobile. They would be occupied for shorter periods. The emphasis was on minimizing American casualties while maintaining enough presence to support South Vietnamese forces. The last major firebase battle involving significant American forces was FSB Ripcord in July 1970. That battle, which lasted 23 days and cost 75 American lives, showed that even well-defended fire bases could be overwhelmed if the enemy was willing to pay the price and had the forces to sustain a long siege. But FSB Crook in June 1969 showed what was possible when everything worked right. When the defenses were properly prepared, when the firepower was overwhelming, when the leadership was strong, and when the soldiers had the training and determination to hold the line no matter what the enemy threw at them. The men who fought at FSB Crook that June deserve to be remembered not just for their victory, but for what they represented. American soldiers doing their jobs, holding the line, fighting with courage and skill, and proving that when Americans chose to fight, they could win. Behind the statistics and tactics and weapon systems, the Battle of Fire Support Base Crook was about individual soldiers doing extraordinary things under terrible circumstances. Each man who fought there has his own story. his own memories of those 3 nights, his own moment of fear or courage or determination. Captain Larry B. Thomas from Camp Hill, Pennsylvania, commanded Bravo Company through all 3 nights of fighting. For 72 hours, with only brief periods of rest, he led his men through one of the most intense combat experiences of the war. He moved constantly along the bunker line, checking on his soldiers, directing fire where it was needed, calling in support, making instant decisions about how to respond to each new threat. Thomas would later say that his men knew what to do before he even had to direct them, that they performed beyond his expectations, that he was proud of every one of them. But his men would say the same about him, that he was always where he needed to be, that he kept calm under fire, that his leadership gave them confidence even when the situation looked desperate. After the battle, Thomas was recognized for his performance. His leadership of Bravo Company during those 3 nights became a case study in how to defend a fire base, and he carried the memory of that battle and the pride in his men for the rest of his life. Specialist 4 Richard C. Marroquin from Floresville, Texas, was a machine gunner in one of the bunkers on the northeast sector of the perimeter. On the first night of battle, as sappers infiltrated toward his position, Marroquin made an instant assessment of the situation. He swung his M60 machine gun toward the threat and opened fire. The M60 is a heavy weapon, over 23 pounds when loaded. It fires 7.62mm ammunition from a belt that feeds through the side of the gun. In Marroquin's hands that night, it became the difference between the sappers reaching the wire or being stopped in the cleared area. He fired burst after burst, his tracers reaching out into the darkness, finding targets, bringing them down. And when the NVA responded with RPGs, he kept firing, trusting his bunker to protect him from the incoming grenades. After the battle, Marroquin was commended for his actions, but like many combat veterans, he probably carried mixed feelings about what he had done. Pride in having done his job well, relief at having survived, and the knowledge that he had killed other human beings, even if they were enemy soldiers trying to kill him. Sergeant First Class Donald Neal from Columbus, Georgia, showed quick thinking and initiative on the first night when sappers approached his sector. Instead of just engaging them from his fighting position, he grabbed 2 M79 grenade launchers and several bandoliers of ammunition and moved to where he could get a better angle on the attackers. The M79 grenade launcher is a single-shot weapon that looks like a sawed-off shotgun. It fires a 40mm grenade that arms after traveling a certain distance and then explodes on impact. It is an area weapon, effective against troops in the open or in light cover. Neal and another soldier worked together, firing grenade after grenade at the sappers, lobbing the 40mm rounds in high arcs that dropped among the attacking enemy. The sappers, caught between the M79 fire and the machine guns from the bunkers, pulled back. They tried to withdraw to the nearby woodline, but there was no safety there either because the artillery was pounding that area with high explosive shells. Neal's quick action and aggressive use of the M79 helped stop that portion of the assault before it even reached the wire. First Lieutenant Curtis McFarland from Midland, Texas, commanded one of the platoons in Bravo Company. During the second night's attack, his sector of the perimeter came under heavy assault. Sappers trying to breach the wire, infantry massing for an assault behind them, mortars and rockets falling all around. The situation was chaotic and dangerous. McFarland kept his men organized and fighting. He called for artillery support on the enemy formations outside the wire. He made sure his machine gunners had clear fields of fire. He checked ammunition supplies and made sure positions that were running low got resupplied. And he projected calm confidence even though he must have been as scared as any of his men. Platoon leaders in Vietnam faced enormous responsibilities. They were often only 23 or 24 years old, fresh out of college and officer candidate school, or ROTC, and they were responsible for the lives of 30 or 40 men in combat. Many platoon leaders did not survive their tours in Vietnam. They were targeted by enemy snipers and were often killed while leading their men in action. McFarland survived FSB Crook and went on to complete his tour. But he never forgot those 3 nights and the men he led. First Lieutenant William Irvin from Richmond, Virginia, commanded Alpha Company, which was air assaulted into an area north of FSB Crook after the second night's fighting to cut off the NVA retreat. As his company followed communication wire left by the retreating enemy, they ran head-on into what appeared to be an NVA regimental headquarters. The fighting was close and intense. enemy troops in bunkers and fighting positions, Alpha Company trying to maneuver while under fire. Irvin called for tactical airstrikes and tried to work his way around the enemy position. But darkness was falling, and continuing the fight at night in close terrain against an unknown number of enemy troops was too dangerous. He made the decision to break contact and return to FSB Washington. That decision, to break contact rather than get drawn into a night fight, showed good tactical judgment. Irvin could have pressed the attack, trying to overrun the enemy position and count a big body count. But he would have risked heavy American casualties in the process. Instead, he accomplished his mission of disrupting the enemy retreat, gathered intelligence on enemy positions, and brought all his men back safely. The artillery crews of Alpha Battery, 7th Battalion, 11th Artillery were the unsung heroes of the battle. These were the men who loaded and fired the howitzers, often under mortar and rocket fire, knowing that their position was a primary target for the NVA. The gun crews worked through all 3 nights, firing mission after mission, their ears ringing from the constant explosions, their hands blistered from handling the hot shell casings, their arms aching from loading round after round. Each gun crew consisted of 5 or 6 men: the gunner, who aimed the weapon, the assistant gunner, who set the charges, the loaders, who manhandled the heavy shells into the breech, the ammunition handler, who brought shells forward from the stockpiles. They worked as a team, and their speed and accuracy were critical to the defense. When firing beehive rounds at close range, the gun crews had to overcome the psychological challenge of firing at targets they could see. Normal artillery fire is indirect. The crew aims at coordinates on a map and fires without seeing the target or the results. But when firing beehive rounds horizontally at attacking infantry, the crews could see the enemy soldiers, could see the results when the flechettes struck. This required a different kind of courage. The forward observers, the artillery officers who called in the fire missions, were with the infantry in the bunkers around the perimeter. They had to spot targets in the darkness, often under fire, and call in accurate fire missions without hitting friendly positions. The forward observers at FSB Crook performed flawlessly throughout all 3 nights, bringing artillery fire danger close to the American perimeter and devastating the attacking enemy. The helicopter pilots who flew gunship missions over FSB Crook showed tremendous skill and courage, flying at night over a hot combat zone, taking ground fire from enemy weapons, placing rockets and minigun fire exactly where the ground troops needed it, required exceptional flying ability and nerves of steel. The Cobra pilots would make gun run after gun run, diving toward the target, firing rockets, braking hard to avoid ground fire, climbing back to altitude, and doing it again. The door gunners on the UH-1 Huey helicopters that accompanied the Cobras would lean out the open doors with their M60 machine guns and fire at any enemy troops they could see. Every mission over FSB Crook was dangerous, but the pilots kept flying because they knew the troops on the ground were depending on them. The Air Force pilots flying the Spooky and Shadow gunships orbited overhead for hours, their sensors searching for enemy troops, their miniguns engaging any concentration they found. These aircraft were vulnerable to ground fire, especially from heavy machine guns that the NVA used for air defense. But they stayed on station throughout the night, providing constant fire support. And then, there was the one American soldier who died during the 3 nights of fighting at FSB Crook. His name is known to the veterans who were there. His family mourned his loss, and his sacrifice should never be forgotten. In a battle where over 400 enemy soldiers were killed, one American death might seem insignificant. But to his family, to his friends, to the men who served with him, his death was a tragedy. He likely died from the enemy mortar or rocket fire that fell on FSB Crook during the attacks. Perhaps a direct hit on a bunker, perhaps shrapnel from a near miss. We may never know exactly how he died, but we know he was serving his country, defending his fellow soldiers, doing his duty, and he paid the ultimate price. Every man who fought at FSB Crook has his own story. Some of those stories have been told, many have not. But each man who was there, who heard the incoming mortars, who saw the enemy charging through the darkness, who felt the concussion from the beehive rounds and the artillery barrages, carries the memory of those 3 nights in June 1969. The Battle of Fire Support Base Crook in June 1969 provided numerous lessons about combat, about tactics, about leadership, and about the nature of the Vietnam War. Some of these lessons were learned immediately and applied to future operations. Others took years to fully understand and appreciate. The first and most obvious lesson was that properly prepared defensive positions, manned by well-trained troops with adequate fire support, were essentially invulnerable to frontal assault. The NVA threw thousands of troops at FSB Crook over 3 nights. They accepted horrific casualties. They showed tremendous courage and determination, and they never came close to breaking through the American defenses. This lesson validated the entire concept of fire support, bases as it had evolved by 1969. Build strong defensive positions. Give them overwhelming firepower. Use them as bases for offensive operations, and as anvils against which the enemy could be destroyed. The strategy worked. The second lesson was the critical importance of intelligence and early warning. The sensors and radar at FSB Crook gave the defenders hours of advance notice that an attack was coming. This allowed them to prepare, to position their forces optimally, to pre-plan fire missions, and to arrange for air support. Without that early warning, the defenders might have been caught by surprise and not had time to respond effectively. This lesson led to increased emphasis on sensors and surveillance technology throughout the rest of the war. Ground sensors, aerial reconnaissance, signal intelligence, all were integrated into the defensive planning for fire support bases and major installations. The third lesson was the value of combined arms integration. No single weapon system won the battle at FSB Crook. It was the combination of infantry small arms, fire, artillery, helicopter gunships, fixed-wing gunships, and tactical airstrikes, all working together in a coordinated defensive plan that defeated the NVA attacks. This integration required good communications, proper training, experienced leaders who understood how to employ all these assets, and the logistical support to keep ammunition flowing and aircraft flying. The American military in 1969 excelled at this kind of integration, and FSB Crook showed why it mattered. The fourth lesson was about leadership. Captain Thomas and the other leaders at FSB Crook made the difference between a successful defense and a disaster. Their calm under fire, their tactical decisions, their ability to inspire confidence in their men were all critical. Leadership cannot be taught from a manual. It is developed through training and experience and is proven in combat. The fifth lesson was about the importance of preparation. The time and effort spent clearing fields of fire, building strong bunkers, positioning sensors, registering artillery, conducting rehearsals, all paid enormous dividends when the battle started. There is an old military saying that the more you sweat in peace, the less you bleed in war. FSB Crook proved that saying true, but there were also larger strategic lessons that took longer to learn and appreciate. The Battle of FSB Crook, for all its tactical brilliance and one-sided outcome, did not change the strategic situation in Vietnam. The NVA was defeated at FSB Crook, but they were not destroyed. They retreated across the border into Cambodia, where American forces could not follow. They rested, refitted, replaced their casualties, and returned to fight another day. This was one of the fundamental frustrations of the Vietnam War. American forces could win every tactical engagement. They could kill far more enemy soldiers than they lost. They could dominate the battlefield whenever they chose to fight. But none of this translated into strategic victory because the enemy had sanctuaries where they could rest and regroup, and because the political will to continue the war was eroding in the United States. FSB Crook was a spectacular tactical victory, but it did not bring the war any closer to an end. The NVA would continue to fight. American casualties would continue to mount. And by 1973, American forces would withdraw from Vietnam, having won almost every battle but lost the war. Another lesson, one that was not fully appreciated until years later, was about the limits of firepower. The Americans at FSB Crook had overwhelming firepower advantage. They used it to devastating effect, and it worked in that specific situation. But firepower alone could not win the Vietnam War. The war was not just a military contest. It was a political struggle for the loyalty of the South Vietnamese people. It was a test of wills between North Vietnam and the United States. It was a limited war for the United States, but a total war for North Vietnam. And in that larger context, tactical victories like FSB Crook, while important for the soldiers involved and valuable for demonstrating American capabilities, did not determine the war's ultimate outcome. The final lesson, one that resonates to this day, is about the courage and professionalism of American soldiers. The men who fought at FSB Crook did their jobs under extraordinarily difficult and dangerous circumstances. They did not choose to be in Vietnam. They did not make the strategic decisions about how the war would be fought. But when asked to hold a firebase against overwhelming enemy attacks, they did so with skill and determination. This is the enduring legacy of FSB Crook, not the tactics or the weapons or the statistics, but the men who fought there. They represented the best of American military tradition, citizen soldiers called to serve, professionals doing their jobs, young men facing fear and death and doing their duty anyway. They deserve to be remembered and honored. The Battle of Fire Support Base Crook was fought with technology that was cutting edge for 1969, but seems primitive by modern standards. Understanding the weapons and equipment available to both sides helps explain why the battle unfolded the way it did, and why the Americans had such overwhelming advantages. The M16 rifle that American infantrymen carried in 1969 was a significant improvement over earlier models. The early M16s issued in 1965 and 1966 had reliability problems, particularly in the harsh conditions of Vietnam. The rifles would jam during firefights, leaving soldiers defensively with non-functioning weapons. By 1969, many of these problems had been solved through modifications to the rifle and improvements to the ammunition and magazines. The M16A1, the version most commonly used by 1969, was a lightweight automatic rifle firing 5.5 6mm ammunition. It had a 20 or 30 round magazine and could fire in semi-automatic or full automatic mode. The lightweight ammunition meant soldiers could carry more rounds than with a heavier 7.6 2mm ammunition used by the M14, and the rifle's relatively low recoil made it controllable even in full automatic fire. The M60 machine gun was the squad automatic weapon, typically 1 per squad or 2 per platoon. This belt-fed machine gun fired 7.62mm ammunition at a rate of 550 rounds per minute. It was heavy, over 23 pounds when loaded, but it provided the heavy firepower that rifle squads needed. The M60 could suppress enemy positions, provide covering fire for advancing troops, or defend a fixed position like a bunker. At FSB Crook, the M60 gunners in the bunkers were critical to the defense. Their sustained fire kept the NVA assault troops pinned down in the kill zones and prevented them from reaching the wire. The gun could fire for extended periods as long as the ammunition held out, and the barrel did not overheat. Experienced gunners knew how to fire in controlled bursts to conserve ammunition and prevent barrel damage. The M79 grenade launcher gave infantrymen the ability to deliver indirect fire at ranges up to 400 meters. This single-shot weapon fired a 40mm grenade that could be high explosive, illumination, smoke, or other specialized rounds. The M79 was particularly effective against enemy troops in trenches or behind cover, where rifle fire could not reach them. At FSB Crook, M79 gunners engaged sappers and assault troops in the cleared areas around the firebase, lobbing grenades that exploded among the attackers. The M72 Law, light anti-tank weapon, was a disposable rocket launcher designed to defeat armored vehicles. Each Law was a single-use tube containing a 66mm rocket. When needed, the soldier would extend the tube, aim, and fire. The rocket could penetrate armor or destroy bunkers. While the NVA did not use tanks at FSB Crook, the Laws were available if needed and could be used against fortified positions. The 105mm M102 howitzer was the backbone of American artillery support in Vietnam. This lightweight howitzer could be lifted by helicopter, making it ideal for fire support bases. It had a range of 11.5 kilometers and could fire a variety of ammunition types: high explosive shells for general targets, illumination rounds for lighting up the battlefield at night, white phosphorus for marking or incendiary effects, and the devastating beehive rounds for close-in defense. The beehive round, officially designated M546, contained 8,000 steel flechettes. When fired, the round would burst open at a preset distance, typically 50 to 100 meters from the muzzle, spraying the flechettes in a cone pattern. Each flechette was a small steel dart about 1.5 inches long with fins for stability. The fléchettes would tumble through the air and impact with enough energy to penetrate human bodies. A single beehive round could cover an area the size of a football field with deadly projectiles. At FSB Crook, the beehive rounds were the most devastating weapon in the American arsenal. When fired point-blank at massed NVA assault formations, each round killed or wounded dozens of men. The psychological effect was enormous. Soldiers who survived a beehive barrage described it as like being in a hailstorm of steel. The fléchettes would strip bark from trees, shred vegetation, and tear human bodies apart. The Americans also had access to more advanced technology for detection and surveillance. The ground sensors deployed around FSB Crook were part of a system originally developed for the McNamara line along the DMZ. These sensors could detect movement, sound, or ground vibration. When activated, they would transmit a signal back to monitoring equipment at the firebase. Different types of sensors provided different capabilities. Seismic sensors detected footsteps and vehicle movement. Acoustic sensors picked up sounds like voices or vehicle engines. Magnetic sensors could detect metal objects like weapons or vehicles. The radar system at FSB Crook was a ground surveillance radar designed to detect movement at ranges up to several kilometers. The radar could track multiple targets simultaneously and could operate in complete darkness or through jungle canopy. The radar operators would see blips on their screens representing moving targets and could vector artillery fire or airstrikes onto those targets even without visual contact. Starlight scopes, the early night vision devices, amplified ambient light from the moon and stars to allow soldiers to see in conditions that would otherwise be pitch black. These scopes were bulky and had limited range compared to modern night vision, but they gave American forces a significant advantage in night fighting. A machine gunner with a starlight scope could see enemy troops moving in the darkness and engage them accurately, while the enemy could not see the American positions. The helicopter gunships that supported FSB Crook were armed with devastating weapons. The AH-1 Cobra was specifically designed as an attack helicopter. It mounted a nose turret with a 40mm grenade launcher and a minigun, plus wing-mounted rocket pods. The minigun could fire 4,000 rounds per minute. The rockets, typically 2.75-inch folding-fin aerial rockets, could be fired in salvos that would blanket an area with explosions. The AC-47 Spooky gunship was a converted cargo plane mounting 3 side-firing miniguns. Each minigun could fire 6,000 rounds per minute. When all 3 guns fired simultaneously, the Spooky could put a bullet in every square foot of a football field in less than 3 seconds. The stream of tracers from the miniguns looked like a solid red line reaching from the sky to the ground. The psychological effect on enemy troops was terrifying. The AC-1 Centene Shadow gunship was larger and more capable than the Spooky, with more miniguns and the ability to carry more ammunition and stay on station longer. Both gunships had flare dispensers to illuminate the battlefield and sensors to detect enemy troops and vehicles. The NVA forces attacking FSB Crook had their own weapons, though generally less sophisticated than the American arsenal. The AK-47 assault rifle was the standard infantry weapon for NVA troops. Rugged, reliable, and easy to maintain, the AK-47 fired 7.62mm ammunition and was effective at ranges up to 400 meters. It was arguably more reliable than the early M16s, though by 1969 the M16's reliability problems had been largely solved. The RPG, rocket-propelled grenade, was the most feared NVA weapon from the American perspective. This shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon could penetrate armor or destroy bunkers. The RPG-7, the most common version in 1969, fired an 85mm rocket with a shaped charge warhead. It was effective at ranges under 300 meters and was devastating against vehicles, bunkers, and helicopters. The NVA also had crew-served weapons, including machine guns, mortars, and recoilless rifles. The 82mm mortar was the standard NVA indirect fire weapon, with a range of about 3 kilometers. The 120mm mortar was heavier, but had longer range and fired a larger shell. Both were used extensively in the bombardments of FSB Crook. The 107mm rocket and 122mm rocket were area bombardment weapons that the NVA used against American bases. These were relatively inaccurate, but could be fired from simple launchers positioned several kilometers from the target. The rockets would arc through the air and impact in or around the target area, creating explosions and sending shrapnel in all directions. But what the NVA lacked was the integration and coordination that made American firepower so effective. They did not have the sensors and radar to detect approaching threats. They did not have the communications to coordinate fires from multiple batteries simultaneously. They did not have helicopter gunships or fixed-wing gunships for close air support. And they did not have the massive artillery support that American forces could call upon. This technology gap, combined with the Americans' superior defensive positions and training, explains why the Battle of FSB Crook was so one-sided. The NVA had courage and determination. They had veteran troops and experienced commanders. But they did not have the tools to overcome the American advantages. And when they tried to assault a well-defended firebase like FSB Crook, they paid a terrible price. The Battle of Fire Support Base Crook is not one of the famous battles of the Vietnam War. Most people who know anything about Vietnam can name Khe Sanh, Tet, Hue, Hamburger Hill, the Ia Drang Valley. But FSB Crook, most have never heard of it. This is unfortunate because FSB Crook deserves to be remembered. It represents one of the most one-sided victories in the history of American arms. 400 enemy killed versus 1 American dead. A defensive battle that was textbook perfect in its execution, and a demonstration of what American soldiers could do when properly led and supported. The men who fought at FSB Crook remember it. The veterans of Bravo Company, 3rd Battalion, 22nd Infantry, the veterans of Alpha Battery, 7th Battalion, 11th Artillery, the helicopter pilots who flew gunship missions overhead, the artillerymen at other fire bases who fired support missions. All of them remember those 3 nights in June 1969. Some of them have shared their stories. Online forums and veteran websites contain accounts from men who were there, photos from the battle, maps showing the firebase layout, descriptions of the fighting. These first-hand accounts are invaluable for understanding what actually happened. One veteran created a website dedicated to FSB Crook, honoring the one soldier who died defending the firebase and the brave warriors of Alpha and Bravo companies who fought off the NVA those dark nights in Vietnam. The dedication reads, "I dedicate this page to him, those that were wounded, and the brave warriors of Alpha and Bravo, Company 3rd 22nd Infantry Walking Regulars who helped us, Alpha Battery, 7th 11th Field Artillery, fight off the NVA those dark nights in Vietnam." This kind of remembrance is important, not just for the veterans themselves who find solace in connecting with others who shared their experience, but for future generations who need to understand what their fathers and grandfathers did in Vietnam. The soldiers who fought at FSB Crook were not baby killers or war criminals or any of the other ugly stereotypes that were sometimes applied to Vietnam veterans. They were American soldiers doing their jobs, and they did those jobs extremely well. The physical site of FSB Crook no longer exists. After the battle, the fire base was likely abandoned or moved to a new location. The bunkers would have been dismantled or destroyed to prevent them from being used by the enemy. The cleared areas would have grown back into jungle within months. Today, you could probably walk through the area where FSB Crook once stood and never know that one of the most intense battles of the Vietnam War was fought there. But the memory remains in the minds of the veterans, in the official records, in the after-action reports filed by the units involved, in the award citations for the men who showed exceptional courage, in the casualty reports that list the 1 American killed and 8 wounded, and in the body count, reports that documented 400 enemy dead. Historians who study the Vietnam War have access to all these records. They can reconstruct what happened at FSB Crook with considerable accuracy. They can analyze the tactics, evaluate the decisions made by the commanders, calculate the firepower employed, and assess the results. What emerges from this analysis is a picture of American military competence at the tactical level. The battle was well planned, well executed, well supported. The defenders had every advantage that technology, training, and leadership could provide, and they used those advantages to achieve a decisive victory. But historians also note that tactical victories like FSB Crook did not lead to strategic success in Vietnam. The war dragged on for 6 more years after FSB Crook. Thousands more Americans would die. Tens of thousands more would be wounded. And in the end, South Vietnam would fall to a North Vietnamese invasion in 1975. Does that strategic failure diminish the achievement of the men who fought at FSB Crook? Absolutely not. They did what they were asked to do. They held their fire base. They defended their fellow soldiers. They killed the enemy while taking minimal casualties themselves. They performed their duty with honor and courage. The strategic failure of the Vietnam War was not their fault. It was the result of political decisions made at much higher levels. The men who fought at FSB Crook can hold their heads high. They won their battle. They proved themselves under fire. And they came home, most of them, with the knowledge that they had done their duty and done it well. Today, as the veterans of Vietnam age and pass away, it becomes increasingly important to preserve their stories, to record their experiences, to honor their service, and to remember the battles they fought, even the ones like FSB Crook that are not famous but should be. The 3 nights in June 1969, when Bravo Company and Alpha Battery held off 2 NVA regiments and killed 400 enemy soldiers while losing only one of their own, is a story worth remembering. A story of courage, of professionalism, of American soldiers at their best. May we never forget the men who fought at Fire Support Base Crook. May we honor their service and their sacrifice. And may we learn from their example of duty, courage, and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. This was the Battle of Fire Support Base Crook. June 5th through 7th, 1969. Bravo Company, 3rd Battalion, 22nd Infantry. Alpha Battery, 7th Battalion, 11th Artillery, 25th Infantry Division, Tropic Lightning. 400 North Vietnamese soldiers killed. 1 American soldier killed. 8 Americans wounded. A trap perfectly set. An enemy completely destroyed. A fire base successfully defended. The walking regulars held the line, and they proved that when American forces chose their ground and fought their way, they could not be beaten. Remember FSB Crook. Remember the men who fought there. And remember that freedom is not free. It is purchased with the blood and courage of soldiers who stand the watch and hold the line against those who would destroy what we hold dear. The Battle of Fire Support Base Crook reminds us of what American soldiers can do when called upon, and reminds us why we owe them a debt we can never fully repay. They held the line at FSB Crook, and they did not break.